Bob Dylan, false prophet, man of wisdom, man of peace, artist, spiritualist, musician, or just a spiritual seeker? Those are just some of the questions that are asked and answered in Stephen Arnoff's first book, Mazel Tov, author of About Man, God, and Law, the Spiritual Wisdom of Bob Dylan. Welcome, Stephen. I'm so glad you're here.
It's great to be here with you and everyone.
In full disclosure, we are cousins, which makes this even more meaningful and in some ways very precious. It's especially meaningful today because we're dedicating the session to our uncle, Jeremy Zwelling. He's actually our cousin who passed away last week after a long battle with an illness. He was such a mentor, spiritual guide, teacher. He was the head of the Jewish Studies Department at Wesleyan for over 40 years. So many students were inspired by him to become rabbis, Jewish professionals, Jewish leaders, both in his family like us and outside of his family. May he rest in peace. May his memory be for a blessing. And let us say amen.
Amen.
Let's dig right in, Stephen. So many books, as you say, are written about Bob Dylan, and yet you go and write another. Is this your spiritual journey? Are you a spiritual seeker? Tell us how the book came about.
Yes, I am a spiritual seeker, and I'm not ashamed to admit it. I'm proud to say that still 52 years in, I'm still seeking. And I think a big part of my search has been through the experience of music, both making music and listening to music, thinking about music, in this case, writing about music. And from the perspective of seeking, I think Bob Dylan models in some very curious ways some of the core elements of what makes spiritual seeking dynamic and alive, never static, and it never stops.
So don't jump ahead. What do you define as a spiritual seeker?
I think curiosity might be one of the first traits that I'd think of. There does seem to be some element maybe of a kind of calling. I'm not sure in your life, how you experience it as a person who's enamored with and engaged with the life of the spirit, thinking about the divine and the human role. But I do point to moments in my life, and those moments brought me to a sense that there was something happening here, to quote Bob Dylan, but you don't know what it is. What is that thing that's happening here? What is that spark that I saw in certain moments? And then this is actually something that Jeremy taught me. Jeremy said to me once, when you have some of these experiences that sort of take you out of yourself to what might even feel like a different place, write them down, because you're going to come back to them again and again. He gave me that advice when I was in my early 20s, and I still use that advice, that idea that there are certain moments of synchronicity and connectedness that serve as kind of like the electric poles attached by wires carrying the current of the spiritual experience through time.
So this spiritual talk for some people is very foreign, and for me is actually just family talk, right?
Yeah,
but
right.
Tell me, when was the first, you became a musician for 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
You opened for Clarence Clemens, forgive me, I'm not a musician myself. Most of my family is. You opened for Clarence Clemens, and yet you're an executive director of the Fuchsberg Center in Jerusalem. Tell us about what happened.
Well, what happened was, in part, that the whole sort of journey of the career that I've had and the different iterations, going from music to teaching to running large Jewish organizations, has been about a kind of looking for meaning, wanting a place for belonging, not just for myself, of course, but for the people who participated in the institutions that I've been blessed to be a part of. Everything to me is a bit like putting together a band. Clarence Clemens is the big man. He was Bruce Springsteen's, one of the members of Bruce Springsteen's very eclectic, very unusual, very interesting array of people who come together, and they became like a community on stage. I've often looked to musicians when I think about Jewish life and what gives it that special quality of you wanting to be in the room and wanting to belong. Something of the magic of music always shifts through wherever I've gone in my career, whether it's been in executive roles or as a performer, as a teacher. Yeah.
So you've always had a passion for music. What was the allure of Dylan? Or maybe as a person that doesn't know Dylan so well, except for reading the book, what
Right.
was the allure of Dylan? Because a lot of people have this fascination with his spiritual seeking as well.
I almost think, to reveal another family secret, I think I was a bit of a cliche. When I went off to college, it might have been 40 years after the first generation went off to college to listen to Dylan. But I got a copy of Freewheelin' Bob Dylan, which is his second album. I put it on my record player and I was just captivated. I was captivated by the lyrics. I was captivated by the voice. I was captivated by the melodies. It was something about Dylan providing a window into a set of feelings or understandings about the world, particularly as a young person, as a young adult, that I didn't hear anywhere else. I loved rock and roll. I loved my Tom Petty, my Bruce Springsteen, my Elvis Costello, but Dylan somehow brought what I call a spiritual wisdom that I didn't quite understand when I was younger, but drew me in.
So you and I know that Dylan was raised a nice NJB, a nice Jewish boy.
That's
Tell
right.
us about the Dylan that was prior to Dylan as we know him, Bob Dylan. What
I
was his
think
original name?
his original name was Robert Allen Zimmerman.
Nice Jewish name.
A nice Jewish American name, right? His roots would be traced back to Odessa. There was recently an article that talked about that. He was born in Duluth, lived in Hibbing, Minnesota. That's really pretty far up north. That is not Los Angeles, right? That's
Not a
iron
lot of
ore
Jews there.
country. Not a lot of Jews, but it was like so many towns across America, a place where Jews settled into certain kinds of professions and sort of filled out all different elements of what was important to these small towns. And the Zimmermans were a family like that. His uncle owned an appliance store. At one point, the family owned the movie theater. It was a very, I think, sort of normal Jewish American middle class life. And he got the bug of music. And by the time he was 20 years old, he was in New York City on the cusp of becoming a huge star.
So you describe him as a spiritual seeker. And
Mhm.
in Judaism, we honor the spiritual seeker. Do you
Mm.
think that's what draws so many people to him, is that there's a little bit of him in each of us?
Oh, that's a beautiful way to say it, Um, yeah, I think that music, if we go to another ancient language, music comes from the word muse, which is that link between the human and the divine. There's something inspired, some kind of light that shines that comes from another place, and the musician's job is to convey that, channel it maybe. And from the perspective of what Dylan provides, there's a lot of things that he does that had never all been done at the same time in one artist, both a songwriter, a strange, not sort of traditional voice, bringing pretty complex and high language to pop melodies, and also taking a position that actually had something to say about society that was disruptive and funny and unusual and sometimes hard to grasp. And these are the things that I think people look for sometimes in religion on the one hand, and on the other hand, a sort of community of people became the fans of rock and roll, and that group grew and grew and grew. And that was a place to belong. It was about making community too.
So on the one hand, there's a really positive element that Dylan created a sense of belonging and asked tough questions and answered them in ways that people can relate to. But you and I, the danger of that false prophet of people replacing religion with the Dylan religion, and we hear about it. There are Dylan fanatics. So
Yeah.
do you think he understood that responsibility? But before we even say that, what do you think are the dangers? Do you think people replace Judaism, especially with Dylanism?
Oh, that's a good one. Let's see. First of all, I would say that Dylan has never wanted to be anyone's rabbi, anybody's Rebbe. He has not wanted to be someone who had disciples. He was not interested in that. He had many, many teachers. He'd go through a series of teachers. He'd learn from them almost exhaustively and then move on to the next one.
Why don't
He
you think
has
he's
said,
stuck?
why don't
Because
I
he was
think
in the
he's stuck?
Christians and then he was in a Chabad movement. What made him constantly be moving on?
Restlessness, curiosity, a hunger to know more, a kind of need to flip things and disrupt things and seek out change. When he says at times they are changing, it's never quite clear how much he was changing the times and how much the times were changing him. And from that perspective, I think he is someone who really loves to seek out and find the ways of what's new, what's challenging, what he's curious about. And the seeking is always about looking for meaning, looking for a way to bring things together in a different way. It's true of the music as well.
So we talk about a good Jew being someone who's observant, or a good Jew being someone who's a spiritual seeker and is constantly questioning. In your opinion, would you call him a good Jew?
Well, I think that he probably has a mixed reputation amongst many Jews because he embraced born again Christianity at a key point in his career. And that was very upsetting for a lot of people. He never fully renounced it, but he did actually enter into that realm in a pretty serious way. I would say that from the perspective of being a good Jew, he would probably be a good Jew because he'd flip it into a question and he'd ask you and me, well, what is a good Jew? So I think he would turn that into a question.
He'd probably be a great guest at the Passover Seder.
Well, you really should extend that invitation because he's pretty much your neighbor. He lives in Malibu when he's around the area. So, I want to encourage you to, if you can't get Elijah this year, maybe you can get Bob.
Right. So I want to really talk about the intersection of music and religion, because you spent multiple pages writing not just about Dylan, but about music in general, and that it's been a pivotal player in your spirituality. And I think many people feel that. And I want you to say, or tell us, what are the limits to which music can replace religion, and can it replace religion?
I think there are rituals to music. There are rituals to going to a concert or purchasing your latest music or talking about music with your friends and your family. But there is something about making kiddush or making a motzi or refraining from work on Shabbat from a Jewish perspective. Those kinds of disciplines and rituals that really ground you in the tradition with yourself and other people, that's harder to find in music. If I am a musician who is fully grounded in my discipline of music, I may have all kinds of disciplines, but for the music fan, it probably doesn't create that universe of experience that it would create if it had its own signature rituals the way that Judaism does, or any
Right. So there's a
legacy
limit
tradition.
to which, there's a limit to which music can be your religion. And then there's something that Judaism transcends it. Is that what you would say?
I would say that there is a way that music and the importance of music does serve to replace in certain ways what traditional religion did for people over millennia. But it was not and cannot, I don't think, replace the core discipline and structure of the ritual and the observance of tradition. So to that end, I don't think it's unusual for artists to have to wrestle with what it means to have a religious lifestyle and a musical lifestyle at the same time. That can be a challenge.
So a lot of people would say that Dylan is truly spiritual, and they use that to say, I'm not religious, I'm spiritual. How do you think Dylan would have responded to that?
First of all, it's hard to find the word for spirituality in Hebrew, in traditional Jewish language. So we say ruchaniyut, which comes from the word ruach, meaning spirit. But it's really a less common way of thinking in Jewish tradition. We don't really have a way of talking about spirituality. So from the perspective of, what we might say about it or what Dylan might say about it, Dylan has said that the songs are his prayer book. The songs are his lexicon. He experiences in his life as a musician, as a creator, something that is akin to a pantheon of spiritual guides, a set of liturgy, which is the music, the performing practice, the lifestyle. All of these things add to the elements. Whether he would say that it is a spiritual practice, I think that he describes his experience as a creator and a music maker in lots of ways that reflect spiritual practice. And to my mind, there is a lot that a person, whether they consider themselves a religious, observant person, or a person who is a secular person but curious about religion, there is a spectrum that Dylan represents. And that spectrum really is what interested me as well, because I am curious about how people make meaning if they don't come from a tradition and they want to find something that really is going to matter to them, in the same way that if someone is in a tradition, how do they enrich that tradition in a way that makes it stickier and something that they really want to deepen their experience of.
We're clearly family, because that's like, for some reason, that was the communicated in all the family, which is like, make meaning in your life and help others do that. And don't be beholden to one particular practice. So I love just hearing your own theology. There's something else that I want to say about this. Dylan, I would say, was a bit of, he wouldn't describe himself as a rabbi, but he was a midrashist, meaning a midrash is when you fill in the blanks in the story or in the canon of the Jewish tradition. Where there's blanks, you fill in the story. The best example that I can think of in sort of the national arena is The Red Tent by Anita Diamond. So would you say that Dylan was a modern midrash like writer, and that's how he sort of found his place and his Judaism? And how does that impact how we see ourselves contributing to the tradition?
Well, I'll give two brief answers, and I'll encourage people to read the book about Man and God and Law, Spiritual Wisdom of Bob Dylan, because I get into this quite a bit. The first is a simple example for those who want to take their minds back to 1965's Highway 61 Revisited. God said to Abraham, "Kill me a son," etc., etc. It is a midrash, or an interpretation on the story of Akedat Yitzchak, the sacrifice of Isaac. It's a direct midrash, and it has all the elements of midrash. On the other hand, I would say that the folk tradition, the music tradition that Dylan is a part of, is by its own nature kind of midrashic. And I mean by that, it is a tradition that is an oral tradition. It responds to traditions that came before it, and it is interested in slightly changing, filling in gaps, making an anonymous character real, providing more color. The same things that Midrash does for sacred text, songs do for each other.
Interesting. I love that. And yet we've got a question. I think it's so interesting that, it's surprising that we'd have this conversation on Maven because of Dylan's departure from Judaism. And actually, I don't think it's surprising at all, right? Everybody's Jewish journey is not linear. I wanted you to talk about not only his Jewish journey, but yours as well.
Yeah, I think that I certainly come from a family that was engaged with Judaism in the category of conservative Jews. Actually gave a talk earlier this week at Park Synagogue, which is the synagogue that I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio. But for me, there was something missing. When we met in Israel, I was studying in yeshiva, and I was looking for both the skills to be able to deepen my understanding of text, but also to live in a kind of Jewish community that was sort of hungry for something that went beyond the sort of staid Judaism that I knew from my childhood. And for me, it's been a journey that's included getting a degree, a doctorate in Midrash from the Jewish Theological Seminary, in scriptural interpretation from the Jewish Theological Seminary. I did a postdoc at NYU in the School of Law, actually looking at themes of law in rock and roll, not just Dylan, but in rock and roll. I have, as you mentioned, I'm on my way back to Israel, where I live. I live in Jerusalem. My greatest accomplishment is raising four people who live in Israel and thrive, thank God, in Israel. It's very important to me. Israel is central in my life, and that is a deep part of my Jewish identity and my identity as a human. And so I would say that all along the way, I have tried to maintain a healthy sense of rebellion about any of the systems that I've gotten involved with, but I also have deep, deep respect for tradition. So it might remind you of someone that you know too.
Yes. So I want to go back to Dylan because we're getting so many questions, Stephen. And I think the fact that you wrote a book about him and other musicians has really stirred the zeitgeist about what is the relationship between Judaism. So I understand Dylan went to Camp Herzl. Are you familiar with this?
Of course, it's legendary. There's a photograph of Dylan still, baby fat on the face, holding his guitar at the age of 16. And literally 4 years later, he's like the guy. So it's amazing. But Camp Herzl it was, and a proud alum I will be. I have spoken to many people who were in his bunk and have many stories to tell.
And yet he still explored Christianity. And there's a lot of
Sure.
questions about what did that exploration look like and how did it lead him to Chabad?
Yeah, it's interesting because from the perspective of what little we know about his personal choices, and that's really less of an area that I concentrate on because Dylan has been a very, very private person. As much as he has shared from the stage and in the recorded music, he is a very, very private person. Even if I didn't want to respect that, I couldn't get into his head, but I leave that part of it alone. I can tell you, though, that from what we know, he has made what I would describe as fundamentalist choices as a practitioner of religion. So from evangelical Christianity, I'm a big fan of Chabad. I have many beloved colleagues, and I've experienced many, many positive things in the Chabad communities around the world. However, I do see the theology as being somewhat extreme in certain ways, with all the love and appreciation I have for it. And I would see that as fundamentalist at its core in certain ways. Dylan makes personal choices of a fundamentalist, which is fascinating for someone who is so open-minded and spiritually charged.
Do you think he ever had grandeur or visions of becoming a religious leader? Because he is very much cultic in that way.
I would say that he tosses off statements like, if I hadn't been Bob Dylan, somebody else would have had to be Bob Dylan if I hadn't invented him. Like there's this idea that he is inhabiting this kind of like iconic figure that had to be. He was the right place and the right time to be that man. In addition to that, I would say that he has been reluctant to be pinned down in any way as being any kind of leader for anything. And yet he has just been part of building a museum to Bob Dylan while living in Tulsa, the Bob Dylan Center. He has curated his legacy with exhaustively curating his legacy. No one has built a legacy akin to what Dylan has built in terms of just saving every scrap of every song lyric, all of the clothes, all of the ticket stubs, all of the recordings, all of the writings, everything. So legacy matters to this man at the same time as he would maybe brush it off and say, doesn't matter. I'm just a song and dance man, which he
Well,
often
it's
says
interesting because you can hear the Judaism reverberate in him with these words of legacy and memory and making an impact. Do you know his current religious beliefs now?
I don't know his current religious beliefs. I know that he talks a lot about God. He talks a lot about mortality. I think that, when I'm standing before the Ark on Yom Kippur for the Ne'ilah prayer, which is the closing prayer of Shabbat, I'm thinking of Dylan's song, Trying to Get to Heaven Before They Close the Door. Now, I don't know that Dylan composed that song for the purpose of Ne'ilah, but it cuts so deep into the feeling and experience of that moment, which is such a critical moment in the Jewish calendar. And there are many other songs. I just spent a Shabbat in residence at Temple Israel in Columbus, Ohio, and we actually created a liturgy around some of Dylan's songs where we interposed the traditional liturgy of Kabbalat Shabbat, of the Friday evening prayers, with Dylan lyrics and melodies. I'm not sure how happy he would be about that, but a great artist often doesn't have control over where their work is going to go. And from a Jewish perspective, it is deep and rich and full of opportunity for Jewish interpretation.
I can just hear all the rabbis listening and all their congregants saying to their rabbis, get the Kabbalat Shabbat with liturgy by Dylan, or get the Ne'ilah with liturgy by Dylan. So you'll have to let us know how that is accessible and where it's accessible.
With pleasure. I'm glad you said that, and I would welcome colleagues and friends reaching out to me to find me either through the Fuchsburg Jerusalem Center, where I'm the CEO, or through mangodlaw.com, which is my website for this particular Dylan project. I am thrilled to continue to experiment with the ways that popular music and liturgy and spirituality can intertwine in unexpected ways.
So have you ever met him, Stephen?
I have not, no.
So it's curious to write a book about someone and about other musicians that you've never met, which is a question, because you don't really have an insider's view. What you have is your lens of which to see this artist. What made you feel like you had the credentials to really communicate how his life and his legacy intersected with Judaism?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I don't know that I have the credentials because they don't pass them out and they don't check them. You just go on your project and see what happens. What I can say is that I've spent tremendous amount of time with the music and reading and thinking and talking and teaching about Dylan. So from that perspective, I've sort of put in my 10,000 hours to coin a phrase. And that I think matters. And we know that is true in any profession, thanks to the research that's been done. And in addition to that, the way I work is kind of meditative and associative. When I want to write about a song, I listen to that song, I spend time with that song, and then I let something kind of come out of that that's associated with other cultural or religious or philosophical ideas, anecdotes, narratives, stories, and that's how I bring it together. So for me, having written a lot of songs myself, I write fiction, I write nonfiction. This is kind of a mix of the pieces. I see it as almost like poetry that's a commentary, sort of like Midrash would work, sort of like scriptural interpretation would work, because I do say about these lyrics that there is an element of sacred text to them, and what we bring to it in the same way that we've never met Moses, but we certainly bring ourselves to those sacred texts. It's not about Moses's biography. We know that Moses's number one quality was humility. That's why he never made it to the land, and why he was buried on the other side of that border. So I think there's a lesson there. The work is what matters, not the worker, because
I couldn't agree more. I couldn't
Yeah.
agree more. So tell me the most Jewish Dylan song and why you chose it.
I have spent a lot of time thinking about in the book. That's another perfect segue to tell people to dig into the book, because I talk about a number of songs at certain depth from a Jewish perspective. I would say "Shelter from the Storm" from Blood on the Tracks, "Oh Sister" from Desire. Those are both mid-70s songs.
And why?
Because I see a lot of the Kabbalistic or Jewish mystical perception of the quote unquote feminine aspect of the divine, the Shekhinah, which I see traced out in certain ways in those songs. And I have a riff on some of the Hebrew interpretation that you could bring, sort of kind of like layers of some of the traditional Hebrew terms with the terms that Dylan is using, without pushing it too far, but more reflective. I would say the song "Senor," which to me is a parable very much like Kafka's Parable Before the Law, which is a deeply Jewish but troubled text that actually talks again about a gate, sort of like the Ne'ilah version of trying to get to heaven before they close the door. That's another one on my list. And a lot of people point to "Neighborhood Bully" off of the album Infidels, which is Dylan's most Zionist song, talking about tongue-in-cheek Israel being the neighborhood bully that's getting kicked around by the tough neighbors. It's a very vociferous early 80s Zionist, I guess, anthem. Not one of his most beloved songs, but certainly one that lays out a very clear vision for Israel's place in history.
And most of our viewers today are literally Dylan experts and asking questions that are so clearly expert. But for the person who's new to Dylan and wants to be introduced, what song must they hear?
What song must they hear? that is sort of like asking which Jewish text Rabbi Akiva would stand on one foot and say, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. That's much easier than to pick a song. That's a beautiful aphorism, right? To pick a song, gosh, the times they are changing is one. I would say Desolation Row is one.
Why?
Because Desolation Row sort of lays out Dylan's mandate. All these people that you mentioned, I know them, they are quite lame. I had to rearrange their faces and give them all another name. Right now, I can't read too good. Don't send me the letters. No, not unless they're written from Desolation Row. The societal disruptor, the poet, the seer, living in a kind of Pompeii of his own experience and putting it back together again in a way that makes sense.
In the book, you talk about the 10 commandments of Dylan. I was fascinated by them. I had a favorite. What's your favorite? You want them all, you have to read the book.
Don't follow leaders, watch the parking meters.
Oh, yeah. I love that one. I also like don't follow leaders, follow teachers.
Yeah. See, I think that Dylan, I learned something recently. I do a podcast and I interview various rock journalists in addition to sharing my own riffs. And I had a conversation recently, actually something that I posted just 2 days ago. That's at mangodlaw.com, wherever podcasts are found.
I love that. I love that you're multi-hyphenated. It's a Zwelling trait.
Yeah. Yeah, we are hyphenated eclectic. And proudly so. That's right.
We're eclectic.
It's always we like the yes and. We like the yes and.
So true.
The thing that I learned in interviewing a colleague by the name of Scott Wormuth, wrestling with the question of whether or not Dylan actually is a teacher. And what I learned by talking to Scott, something I knew but had not come together for me yet, was that Dylan teaches us to read. He is a vociferous reader. He's a student. He always is a student. He's a reader and he's a student. He's 81 years old and he is still working. He reminds me of Leonard Cohen in that sense. It reminds me of an artist who just can't stop working, who just can't stop giving, who just can't stop seeking, who just can't stop exploring. I love that about Dylan. I love that he works. I love that he paints and that he makes sculpture from metal and that he created a whiskey, bourbon, rye set that I had a tasting of just yesterday for the first time. I love that he keeps performing. I love that he keeps writing music. I love that he's hungry to learn. And to me, that's like the greatest model for a teacher that I could ask for. Reminds me of Jeremy, our Jeremy, that curiosity and interest and listening and then sharing back. That to me is.
And you mentioned Leonard Cohen, and someone said, how would you compare the two? And I think you did just beautifully. Anything else you would add?
I think that Leonard Cohen was much more of a liturgical poet, and he saw himself as writing liturgy. We know that from his biographer, Sylvie Simmons, who I interviewed recently. I see Dylan as more of a mystic storyteller. So I think that Dylan is less writing prayers than telling stories. He is writing kind of text, whereas Leonard Cohen really is writing prayers. And I think that the difference between the two of them comes out in conversations that they had with each other about how each of them wrote the songs. And Leonard Cohen, Dylan said to Leonard Cohen, I love that song, Hallelujah. How long did it take you to write it? And Leonard Cohen lied and said 5 years. It had taken 8 years, 80 notebooks, on and on and on. He was embarrassed. Leonard Cohen said to Dylan, how long did it take you to write that song, I love it? He said, 15 minutes. So this is like sort of the funny interplay between the artist. Joni Mitchell and Dylan have a very interesting rivalry as well. I think I would compare Dylan and Cohen also from the respect from the Jewish viewpoint. Leonard Cohen has a much richer, deeper Jewish experience. His grandfather was known as the Prince of Grammar. He was a real expert in Hebrew language, which was unusual. His family was one of the founding families of the Montreal Ashkenazi Jewish community. He was learned. He read Hebrew. He understood the text in the original. And I'm not sure that Dylan actually has that same skill set. And it shows in the way they approach Jewish themes.
You said something that I cannot skip over. It's so important.
Yeah.
When is a story a prayer?
Mm, I
Because aren't
think that,
storytellers prayer tellers, or are they
yeah,
different?
that is way above my spiritual pay grade. I just couldn't say. I've had conversations with people which felt like prayers, a call and response. I've had moments of complete silence, which were prayers. I've had moments of study that felt like a prayer, certainly playing a song. In terms of what is the difference between a story and a prayer, me, a story actually has some kind of change or resolution that takes place in the words themselves, whereas a prayer is about a change that takes place in the person who's praying.
Mm,
So
the
that's how I would
transformation.
distinguish the two.
Beautiful. I
Yeah,
love
that's,
that, Stephen. Love that. What do you hope people take away from reading the book?
I hope that people will understand that their love of music is a gateway into a rich life, into a life that provides all sorts of avenues and windows and doorways into meaning, that we shouldn't try to separate between what might be called religious or spiritual culture and popular culture. There are endless ways that popular culture provides us with opportunities to build community, to think about being part of something that's greater than ourselves, to deepen our own sensibility and humility and empathy. The qualities that the great religious traditions at their best strive for are found in popular culture at its best. So I don't believe anyone had written a book about Bob Dylan that placed him in about 500 years of history, whereby we move from the Renaissance to the Enlightenment to modernity, and religion in many ways got stultified, static, and popular culture came and started giving to people what they used to get from religion. I still believe they do. I believe that we live in an age of fundamentalism, which needs to be managed by better storytelling, better prayer, better community building, more belonging, more diversity, because if we do not find a rich, passionate center, we will be challenged by the edges. And I don't believe the edges is where people should be. I think people should find ways to come together. And that's what's embedded in the
Oh my
music.
God, I
That's
just
what's
love,
embedded in the book.
oh my God, that's so beautiful. It's like you want us just to be in the center of the herd. And I think
Yeah.
not on the fringes. It really just resonates for me. But the other thing
Mm.
about it is that pop culture isn't separate from our Judaism, right? That our Jewish spirituality identity is informed by all these external factors, including pop culture. So you don't have to say, I'm a Dylan fan and I'm a Jew. It's like, I'm a Jew, and part of how I express my spirituality is by loving the music of Dylan and the way it's told and how it interfaces with what it means for me to be a Jew. And I think that's what I really took home from the book, which I loved.
Well, you're a teacher and you teach and you explain and you help people frame their spiritual journeys in so many different kinds of ways. And so, I appreciate that you see that in the work that I'm doing. And I think that we all understand that there are many, many pathways into a Jewish sensibility or Jewish experience. At the end of the day, we are invited to bring ourselves fully to the tradition. There is an invitation to show up. And I think if music is the way that people show up, then that's a wonderful way to participate in that journey.
Before we close, who's the next Dylan on the horizon? Anyone that we can identify in the zeitgeist?
I am sort of a student of Daphne Brooks at Yale University. She describes us as living in the age of Beyonce, that the age of Dylan gave way to the age of Beyonce. I'm down with that. If you listen to
Who
Freedom
is the
from
scholar? I
Lemonade,
missed the name. Say it again.
her name is Daphne Brooks. She is a scholar of African American women's and music studies at Yale, and brilliant, and has described the shift from the sort of rock and roll Dylan-esque era to the era of Beyonce. And for me, that is a place to look. I look to women in a lot of ways as being the next generation to pay attention to. I think we've heard a lot of from the dudes, and I am excited about a culture that embraces a much wider range of experiences. It is so hard to say where music's going, and it's so hard to say what will happen to the music of a generation that is now bound to fade. What's amazing is that all of the songwriters of Dylan's generation are selling their songwrites for hundreds of millions of dollars. Somebody out there in the economy of meaning believes that these songs are going to be worth something, not just monetarily, but spiritually, emotionally, psychically, for many, many, many years to come. It's a mystery to be revealed.
A beautiful book about man, God and law. Stephen Arnoff. First of all, I just love you. I don't usually say that to my guests, but I do. And I'm so grateful to be related to you, but even more grateful that you shared your Torah with us, your journey, your book, your words. I can't wait for the next book. I hope you'll come back. We want to thank you all for listening, being a part of Maven.
Thank you.
Keep staying on the journey. We can't wait to have you.